I would like to thank our top sponsors Børge Mo, Matthias Prøy, Fergus Ryan, and Diego for making this show possible. And welcome to the Cave of Apelles. Blissfully unaware, the art world loyally parrots the 18th century philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Tonight's conversation will deal with his aesthetics, but also show the negative impact of his metaphysics and epistemology on classically minded people. If we cannot know reality, then painting it becomes naive. If nothing is objective, then we cannot trust craft rules. And if nothing is universal, then we become miserably estranged from the mythic perspective. My guest is a professor of philosophy, host of the Open College podcast, and the author of Explaining Postmodernism. Stephen Hicks, I'm glad to have you on the show.
Jan-Ove, thanks for the invitation.
So, this is your book, first published in
2004.
2004.
Yeah.
Right. So, should we start from that before we dive into the main character of the evening? I guess it's the main character of your book too, right?
Well, yeah, my claim is, as a matter of intellectual history, that postmodernism has its roots kind of in two figures, and one of them certainly is Immanuel Kant. So postmodernism is a sprawling intellectual movement, but is now saturating many parts of contemporary culture as well. But that is a phenomenon of the 20th century. But in culture and in intellectual movements, things moved slowly. And in this case, when you trace the most important strategic moves, you end up back in the 18th century. And I think especially for the sometimes unsexy issues in metaphysics and epistemology. They're unsexy, but they are absolutely fundamental for philosophy and for a philosophically charged enterprise like art yes. At its highest. Kant is the most important philosopher to grapple with in the last now 2.5 centuries.
Right. So, just to stick with the whole thrust of your book, what do you outline if you give us some bullet points on the whole, like a synopsis, short synopsis of your book?
Yes, okay. Well, so the idea is, by the time we are in the 18th century, we are at the height of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is an extraordinarily optimistic intellectual framework that finally, after centuries and millennia of ignorance and poverty and superstition, we human beings have figured out something fundamental. We can observe the world. We can use our powerful minds rationally to figure out the way the world works. That we need not be bound to superstitions and authority figures who came to power, in many cases prior to human beings being rational and having any glimmer of science and naturalism. So we can figure out the world. We're having a strong sense of what individuals can do in their own lives if they become educated, literate, know something about mathematics. They can take charge of their own intellectual lives, their own religious lives. Many of them can become amazing engineers and scientists. And we can extend this not only to males who first fought for it, but males of all traditional economic classes, but also to women, and then also to people whom we have looked down on for all of human history, basically everywhere. Slavery was normalized, that even slaves should be freed and can become self-governing, rational individuals. So the idea that we can come to learn the world, that we can be rational, that we can extend the power of individuals to govern their own lives, economically, religiously, scientifically, technologically. We should be able to live longer, solve many of the disease problems that have plagued human beings, live more comfortably, live more adventurously, and more peacefully with each other. All of that is part of the Enlightenment project, and to some significant extent, we still are living in that Enlightenment Enlightenment project. But there were many intellectuals who were unhappy with this modernist direction. And I'm using modernism in a philosophical, historic sense, not
art historical sense.
Exactly right at this point. So we're going back to the last 4 or 5 centuries of intellectual and cultural development, who thought that all of the old gods and the old traditions were being destroyed, or they were being destroyed too quickly, or that without those as an underpinning, the modern world is eventually, after a short burst of apparent creativity and progress, going to regress into some sort of new barbarism. So there was the beginnings of a counter-enlightenment and kind of an anti-modernism that said we needed to go back to some earlier form. And so traditionalism and some forms of conservatism started to reassert themselves in the face of this powerful Enlightenment movement. There were others, though, who wanted to say we can't go back. The cat is out of the bag, so to speak, or the genie is out of the bottle, to change metaphors. So in some sense, we need to go forward. But at the same time, we need to go in a non-Enlightenment direction. The Enlightenment has been oversold, it's too optimistic, or that it is fatally flawed in some of its fundamental assumptions about reason and the capacity of us as rational agents to come to understand the world. And so there was a new forms of skepticism that came to prominence in the latter part of the 1800s. And David Hume is a very famous name here. He is the one who famously, according to Kant, whom we'll be primarily talking about, awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, is his language, that he had complacently bought into some of the Enlightenment mythos that was being created. And then Kant realized that the skeptical challenge was much deeper and needed to be faced. And so he is going to offer some very sophisticated and innovative arguments about human cognition and its capacity to know the world that also are going to undercut the aspirations of the Enlightenment. So the story begins, according to my book, in the late 1700s with a turn away from Enlightenment objectivity and Enlightenment optimism.
Mm-hmm. So in the midst of that, you have the reaction to the Enlightenment.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so the technical historical term is a counter-enlightenment, which is itself a broad movement of people who are opposed to the Enlightenment for various reasons. And the thesis then is going to develop that the counter-enlightenment became increasingly more powerful in its arguments, essentially in its negative arguments, undermining the Enlightenment philosophically on through the 1800s. These things take a long time because the issues are complicated, on into the 1900s, until by the time we get to the middle part of the 20th century, and from a very well-educated, well-read set of new intellectuals, the belief comes to be that the Enlightenment has been entirely discredited. So we have to abandon the Enlightenment, we have to abandon the modern project of transforming our cultural institutions based on the Enlightenment intellectual framework. So the modernity has reached the end of its course. It has been a failure. We need to become post-modern. And that's where that label comes from, self-consciously.
So the postmodernism grows organically, directly out of what you labeled then the counter-enlightenment.
That's right.
And so just to really get it visually clear, like what are the main bullet points for counter-enlightenment?
Well, the Enlightenment is a broad. It says something about reality, or the nature of reality. Reality is the natural world and the physical world first and foremost. We might be able to have arguments that there also is a religious dimension or a transcendent dimension. But if we're going to get there, we're not going to get there through simple-minded faith or seeking mystical insights. We're going to have to adopt some sort of rational scientific method and argue for the existence of a God. So what you find in the Enlightenment epistemologically is we start with nature, and maybe nature is the entire project, and so we have a physicalistic understanding of the world, or it might be underpinned by some sort of God-like figure, but the kind of God-like figure that we are able to argue for and provide evidence for, because we're going to use scientific method, is going to be a more deistic God, a kind of science-friendly God, who perhaps created the universe and formulated the natural laws that the world operates in accordance with science, cause and effect, where the ones that science is discovering, the cause and effect. So maybe you can do that. But if we can't prove it, we're not going to believe in the existence of that kind of God. The Enlightenment also is individualistic. It's individuals who have rationality and the capacity to observe the world and to use their minds to become self-governing moral agents as well as cognizing nature kinds of agents. And the issue of freedom, that people need to think for themselves, they need to be free to experiment in their lives just as scientists do, and to earn the fruits of their experiments if they are successful, but also to bear the costs. So nature, individual freedom, individual moral dignity, and the power of developing one's rational capacity, all of those themes. So the Counter-Enlightenment then is going to be an assault on all of those. Human beings are not rational. They are not fundamentally individual. They do not have agency and autonomy. And any sort of dignity or moral capacity they have is going to be in a non-individualistic form. It's going to be more collectivized, or in some forms of Counter-Enlightenment from a transcendent type of source. So what we then get by the time we work out all of those things in the Enlightenment, the Counter-Enlightenment, is a skepticism, a very thorough skepticism about the power of human reason, a dissolving of the individual into impersonal forces, sometimes impersonal natural forces, but more often impersonal collective social types of forces. So we stop believing in individuals, we stop believing in agency, and this progressive idea that we can figure out the world and improve our lives individually and socially, it gets replaced by a cynicism about human relationships and an overriding pessimism about the human condition that has been created by the middle 20th century.
So there's a kind of indifference that comes in when it comes to living in the actual physical world, so to speak?
It can be an indifference, but it will be a cultivated indifference, because almost all of the people who become postmodern, this starts to become biographical, right, about them, but they are born into the world. And as moderns, there is almost an inescapable sense of progressivism, right? That we are figuring out more and more about the world scientifically, that technologically we are developing tools that enhance the human condition, that we've been very successful at extending freedoms and liberties to all human beings, first all males and then all females, and then members of other religious groups with religious tolerance, and eliminating slavery in this century. So that progress is baked into now modern culture, and I think it's an institutional, psychologically institutional part of modern culture. So what happens, though, I think, is that the people who become skeptical and jaded and cynical, they unlearn all of that as a result of their education. In many cases, these are extraordinarily well-read, intelligent individuals. So they will talk themselves out of, or learn themselves out of, that Enlightenment progressivism. And it might then be that perhaps as a psychological self-protection mechanism, you cultivate a kind of stoicism. Right? I thought the world was going to be this great, beautiful, wonderful place, but now all of that has been exploded. And stoicism, we know, is one way of dealing with, psychologically, a world that is too disappointing for you. So, but that is a cultivated indifference, and it is one strategy.
Right, because I've talked about time and time again of how and I want to direct this towards, as I said, classically minded people. I mean, I'm a painter myself, so but it would of course also affect composers, writers, philosophers. Obviously,
it's
anyone
quite general
working
in the art world. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you can see it very clearly in the art world, and also for classical figurative painters. The awareness of what is in your head, more or less unconscious cultural principles, will guide what comes out through your hand and on the canvas, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's why I want to devote some time now to Mr. Kant, because
Certainly.
I have read the Critique of Judgment and been very concerned with that, what he writes about the genius, and we'll get to all of those things. But I've, through reading about Ayn Rand and through rereading Explaining Postmodernism now, have understood that his ideas of metaphysics and epistemology are the whole fundament upon which everything else is built.
Yes, absolutely.
So the aesthetics is sort of straight on telling what you shall do and what you shall not do, but metaphysics and epistemology is the basement of all this. So. Yeah. First of all, what is metaphysics and epistemology, and then what is particular about Kant's?
Yeah. Well, the primer point on Kant is going to be that self-consciously and explicitly, when you read leading philosophers of art in the 20th century who are reflecting on modernism and postmodernism in the arts, and here I'm thinking of people like Arthur Danto, right, and others, and the leading art critics, people like Harold Rosenberg, Clement Greenberg, explicitly, who are not only reflecting on what's going on in the art world, but actively shaping and picking the winners and the losers in the art world in the 20th century. They are explicitly Kantian, and all of them are saying you cannot understand modern art unless you understand Immanuel Kant, right, explicitly. So just one anecdote, a representative painter here would be Jackson Pollock at the kind of the height of modernism in the 20th century. He was discovered by Clement Greenberg, and Greenberg explicitly says, this, when I saw him, the effect on me was volcanic. And that's in a way a Kantian piece of language right there, that I immediately recognize that this is the great painting of our era. And Greenberg is explicitly in his art critical works, deeply philosophical, saying that he is concerned with the artistic sublime as the organizing and an understandable concept, and that is a purely Kantian concept, and he labels it so. Now, Kant wrote 3 big books, the Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, Critique of Judgment, and he wrote them in that order. They do form an integrated, almost organic whole. One way to think about this is to say the classical philosophical project is to concern yourself with truth, goodness, and beauty. Right? Those are the big 3, truth, goodness, and beauty. Critique of Pure Reason is about the issue of truth. Critique of Practical Reason about the issue fundamentally of goodness, right? And then Critique of Judgment about beauty, aesthetic theory, and so on. And Kant is reaching fundamentally negative conclusions about everything up to his generations at that point. So if we're going to plug into Critique of Pure Reason, obviously the important concept there is the concept of reason, and this is the organizing aspirational concept certainly for the Enlightenment. The claim that reason is competent, that reason is efficacious at objectively being able to discern facts about the world, and then as we self-reflectively figure out how our minds work, developing more powerful reasons and more powerful tools of reason to understand the increasing complexity of the world. So what Kant's project is to say, what exactly can reason know and what can reason not know? Are there limits to reason? Now, everybody at some level will say there are limits to reason, right? So our minds, we cannot know an infinite number of things at one time. We can only attend to a certain number of objects at a given time. When we are engaging in a process of reasoning, we're going to this step and then to this step and then to this step. There's only so many steps that we can pay attention to at a given time. So we are not gods with an infinite capacity for reasoning. Reasoning has to be done carefully. It has to be done step by step. We need to write things down. We need to double check our work. It is hard work. So everyone recognizes that there are limits. We get tired, we get emotional, we make mistakes, and so on. But what Kant is arguing is that at a fundamental level, reason is not able to know the things that philosophers and everyone wants to say are the most important things about the world. That what we call the world, most of us in our commonsensical fact, is not in fact the real world. The world of the senses is a construct made by subconscious or unconscious structural factors of which we are unaware that create this world for our mind's attention. But it is what he calls the phenomenal world, and it is to be distinguished from the real world or the noumenal world, and those are pieces of technology. And he wants to argue that in principle, it's not just that it's difficult to get from our apparent world that we are observing. It is impossible for us to get from the sensory, phenomenal world to reality as it is. And behind all of that is a whole battery of very sophisticated skeptical arguments developed by earlier philosophers and by Kant himself, extending them, to say that we are cut off from reality, cut off from knowing reality. Reason is a subjective capacity, and it knows only a subjectively created reality. It has no objectivity to it and no capacity for knowing real reality. Now, what this then is to say is that if we are saying, well, what is the nature of reality? And that is the philosophers and everybody else's quest. Is there really a God, for example, or a multiplicity of gods? Is space and time real? Do we live in an eternal world? Or did what we call the world come into existence at a certain point in time? Is the universe infinite in space, or is it spatially bounded in some sense? And all of these metaphysical questions. Is nature cause and effect? Or are there exceptions to cause and effect? Elements of chaos really out there in the world? Or are there miracles of some sort? So what really is the way the world works? And we want to know reality. Kant is saying, as a matter of principle, we cannot know if there is a God. We cannot know, actually he says something different about space and time. We can know that space and time are only subjective creations. We can't know if reality out there is really in space and time. We cannot know if reality is governed by cause and effect, or if it's a matter of miracles or some sort of chaos out there. We cannot know if we really have a soul, for example, that is immortal, and that when we suffer bodily death, our soul will separate from our bodies and go to another reality or some other dimension. We cannot know if we have free will. And free will is absolutely important for us to be moral agents. We cannot be moral agents if we don't control the choices we make. So we can't know any of these things, Kant is saying, about reality. We are deeply skeptical.
So this is where I understood the immense importance of that for your whole outlook on life. And Ayn Rand has this idea of a sense of life reflected in a painting or in literature. And if that is your sense of life, then it's a self-defeating process. I'm just trying to tie it in and see how does what you're saying now affect a classically minded painter to stick to one profession.
That's right.
You cannot know reality, so why? I don't know if the book is there or not. And you lose the contact with the physical reality that you use as something to imitate, right? Yeah. And if there's a question of free will or interconnectedness, then that will affect the type of motifs that you paint.
Yes. Now, it might be, and Kant is willing to say, I'm looking at this book, right, that's sitting on the table, and I'm looking at you. I can know that there is this book, and I know that you are there, and that I am looking at that. But if you are an artist, and you're a serious artist, you aren't doing trivial things. So if all you want to do is just do pictures of the book sitting on the table, if you though come to believe that the book on the table is just a phenomenal construct in my mind, then it loses its importance.
Yeah.
It loses its significance.
So there comes in a sort of a indifference.
That's right.
To what you're looking at, and that, just jumping slightly forward a little bit, in the Critique of Judgment, where his big idea is the aesthetical indifference. You don't. Okay, so to illustrate, the painter he would not endorse would be Rubens with the fat women and the sensual fat women and the strong men, right? That's too appealing to the senses, and then of course that's trusting the senses, and you get all of those philosophical problems that you don't have if you just see a beautiful fat woman and you want to paint her, right?
So then the issue is, what is the importance of the sensory world? And going back to the Greek concept of aesthetics, right, which is a sensory engagement with the world.
Initially,
yeah. Then suddenly what we are saying is the world of the senses is not real in a fundamental sense. It's also not objective in a fundamental sense, and it becomes less important in a fundamental sense.
So that reminds me of something. It seems like that what Kant is doing is taking, for example, aesthetics, and he takes it and twists it to the opposite of what it actually originally was.
So he takes the aesthetics out of art, is one way of putting it.
Yeah, that's a bigger discussion too, because if you're talking about art and you're talking about fine art as a system that came in the 18th century, that he helped construct, is the grandfather of the whole thing. But so let's just jump back and forth. In the Critique of Judgment, he does say that it's only when you don't know what you're doing that you're creating art.
Yes,
explicitly saying that
that's
art.
Right.
So if he should use the old art term as in knowledge, he would say you only know things when you don't know things.
Right. And that kind of verbal play is worth exploring, and it does come out of this tradition as well. But another way to put this is to say that obviously in art history there has been a long tradition of dissatisfaction with the sensory world, with the perceptual world, with the physical world, the sense that there is a higher world that is non-sensory, non-physical, and in some sense what the artist needs to do, or the philosopher needs to do, is turn off their senses, in some cases turn off their minds, disengage from their physical body, and try to disengage from the entire physical world in order to tap into or be revealed to by this non-sensory, non-physical higher world. So that metaphysical understanding of art has also led to a devaluation of the physical. What Kant, in a way, is doing is taking that tradition, but not putting it on a metaphysical footing first and foremost. He's approaching it through issues of cognition. Right. And through issues of epistemology, to use the philosophical language.
Right,
which is to say that what we call the object of knowledge is created by our cognitive faculties. Right? And so what we have then is a subjectively created world that we take to be reality. And beyond that is an unknowable noumenal realm, or an unknowable real reality.
So this is a connection with the whole postmodern idea too, that there's a constructed reality, subjectively constructed reality, right?
Yeah, so down the road it's going to come out in that form as well. That's right. So also then, if we wanted to come back just on the sensory issues, so if you want to say it's important for me, say as a classically trained artist or as a representational artist, to look very carefully at the world and to become a very good observer. And to use my senses very well. And then also to start using the tools of science, measurement and perspective and understanding geometry, on the assumption that all of that is revealing real features of
relating
the world.
empirically to the physical
That's
world.
right, yeah. So there's an integration of the rational with the empirical.
Right.
So I want it sensorially and rationally to be correct. And so I'm going to be using all of the tools and technologies of science. So I am developing myself as a good observer, as a good mathematician, and I'm going to learn about the chemistries of paint and all of the sciences.
Compositional rules.
That's right.
And, yeah.
So I'm developing...
There's certain objective things you can
That's
learn.
right. So I'm doing all of this objectively and
yeah.
rationally, and it's all integrated into a whole. Yeah. Well, what the Kantian move then comes along is to say is that, well, all of that is subjective.
Bah humbug.
Well, that's right. So space is an inbuilt category of your subconscious mind. And when whatever comes in from external reality goes through our senses, gets filtered, and it gets constructed into a spatial reality. And the same thing for time and things in cause and effect relations. Those are also subjective categories that are added to it. So all of this rational concern with getting the spatial proportions right and the temporal portions right is, again, devalued. You are only becoming very good at studying this subjective phenomenal world, but what's reality? What's really out there?
Yeah.
You're missing all of that.
So he taps into, in some way, he taps into the spiritual, religious realm.
It is a happy coincidence if you start from a traditional religious perspective, right? That Kantian skeptical conclusions will give you a shot in the arm. They will give you a revitality. And Kant is explicit about this in Critique of Pure Reason. There's a famous phrase where he says, I am denying knowledge of reality. Our reason is not going to get us knowledge of reality in order to make room for faith. So there is a kind of religious heritage that he wants to make space for. And this is part of Counter-Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment project is corrosive and had been corrosive to a traditional religious worldview. The Enlightenment project says we start by observing the world, and we don't observe gods. And we do science, and we rationally try to figure out the world. And maybe we do arguments to more theoretical constructs and so forth. But if those arguments get exploded or defeated, then we're not going to believe in those theoretical constructs. So it becomes, from the Enlightenment perspective, if you are going to believe in God, it can't be a faith move. It can't be just a tradition move. You have to show the evidence, show the arguments for the existence of God. And so a big part of the Enlightenment was this century-long, very intense engagement at a highly sophisticated level with all of the arguments for and against the existence of God. And one of the things that Kant is concluding explicitly is that all of the arguments for the existence of God fail, just on their own terms. And he's adding this philosophically heavy-duty conclusion, they have to fail. Because if we're going to try to argue, we are using reason about what's really ultimately out there in reality, and he philosophically is cutting all of that off. We cannot know if there is a God out there. So if we are rational, we cannot believe in the existence of God. But that leaves open the door, as he said, if we are going to believe in God, an immortal soul, that we have a God-given, say, free will to become morally responsible agency, that has to be, at a deep level, a matter of faith.
Right.
And reason cannot attack that faith, because reason is limited only to its subjective constitutional world. So that is going to open the door to a new kind of, or a resurgent kind of religiosity in the modern world. So
again, from a painter's perspective, if I understand you correctly, Kant is saying that we cannot know anything about whatever is metaphysical.
Correct.
And we cannot know anything about what is physical.
What we can do is redefine knowledge. Right? So what we can then say is we do have this perceptual world, that we have to understand it philosophically as a subjective construct.
But it's not saying that we're literally constructing everything in our heads. I mean, it's like in The Devils by Dostoevsky, you have that, what's his name, who commits suicide to eradicate the world.
Yeah.
I mean, that Kant is not in that position.
He's
right?
not in that way. We call that solipsism. In that, and that's a later possibility. And many philosophers in the post-Kantian tradition are grappling with how to escape solipsism.
So
but he is saying that we literally are constructing phenomenal reality. But it's not your conscious mind that is doing it. It all happens at a subconscious level. And we can use the concept of knowledge and the concept of truth and objectivity, but it all philosophically has to be nested. That's right.
Quotation marks.
That's right. It has to be nested with an understanding that ultimately we are in a subjective reality.
Okay, so this is when we stop thinking about it, we start feeling about it.
Well, no, not for Kant. That's going to be in the next generation.
Right.
Kant is very
so
much,
let's be fair. Okay.
He is very much anti-feeling, right, about this.
Okay.
But your hand gesture a moment ago was exactly right. Again, some centuries, generations later, as this broad Kantian movement works out through a number of variations, we start finding thinkers who will say knowledge, and we put it in quotation marks, or truth in quotation marks, and that's.
And you seem very intelligent when you say knowledge.
That's right. Well, that's to indicate a skeptical distancing from that point, and that is post-Kantian.
And that's interesting too. Then, so okay, so there are a couple of things here. How this manifests in painting. You have so there are several examples I can mention. One thing is you have Edvard Munch, who, that's also a quite famous quote. He talks about when it becomes so-called modern. He says he sort of writes about the critics, and he says that they cannot understand that to me the sky is green, and that is more or less, as I understand it, a direct consequence of the epistemology then of Immanuel Kant, right? Because there's a subjectivism there. It appears so to me.
Yes. I think there's a couple of moves that have to happen first. So Munch is a century after Kant, right? So his turn is, I think, in the 1890s, right? And Kant is doing this writing, Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, the first edition. Second edition in 87. Critique of Judgment is a couple of years later, 1790. So partly, though, Kant had wanted to argue for a kind of universality. So he says, yes, it is a subjective creation, but all human beings have the same subjective constitution.
So there's some kind of objectivity. I'm doing quotation marks all the time now.
That's exactly right. So objectivity is not quite the right word here, but he wants to say it's universal. So it is not objective. Because objective is to say there is an object independent of me that is what it is, and I, the subject, am coming to know it. So what Kant is saying, no, it is subjective, but your subjectivity and mine and everyone else's is the same. We all have the same subjective
Because it has that
constitution.
term subjective objectivity, doesn't it?
Well, technically speaking, that's playing with oxymorons. If you want to say it is a property that holds for the whole category or for the whole class, the right term is universal. Right. So it is subjective universalism that Kant is arguing for. And so then he wants to say we can be intersubjective. Notice we're doing this again. Yes, that's right. So that's right. So it's not that I'm in my own subjectivity and you are entirely in your own subjectivity. Because we have the same universal constituting factors, we can be intersubjective, or there's a universal subjectivity. But what happens, though, in the next generations, though, is to say, well, how does Kant know that? How does he know that your subconscious constituting factors are doing the same thing that my unconscious constituting factors are? I can't jump outside of my subjectivity and into your subjectivity or into your unconscious subjectivity to see what's really going on there. That is an assumption that Kant is making, and that assumption can be challenged, and a certain number of the philosophers in the next generation will start to challenge that precisely. Now, we don't want to talk about Hegel and Marx and so forth, but they are exactly, and Nietzsche in the next generation. of developments in German philosophy, all of whom challenge that assumption in various ways. So there's a relativization.
Getting even more subjectivist, or getting subjectivist, you mean?
Well, they are already inside the subjectivity, but now they are abandoning the universality for a kind. And the contrast to universal is relative.
Right. So it's the next part of the rocket. It leaves the last part and then it continues.
That's right. So we then say, well, there are different subjectivities out there. And those subjectivities cannot be translated right across. So maybe different economic classes have different subjectivities, and that's the Marxist version. Maybe the constituting factors evolve across generations, and that's a more Hegelian evolutionary kind of move. And so it can also, though, devolve to the individual level. Maybe my subjectivity and your subjectivity are fundamentally different, that we literally create and see the world differently. And that, I think, is closer to Munch.
Right. And that's where I see that, so if you zoom out a little bit and look at the current situation, we're not going to get into all aspects of wokeness, but it seems to me that the Kantian epistemology and metaphysics, and also the later development through Hegel and etc., they really have had a free playground within what we call art. Because we've gotten used to that this is my understanding of reality and that's different from your understanding of reality. We've gotten used to that through actual visual images. So we learn that there are different subjectivities for each one, because as Kant says in the judgment we'll get to quite soon, there is that originality you have to express. It's my personal view of it. And then what happens now is that sort of the principles of art, or the activities within art, the way of thinking within art, is just let loose on the rest of society. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So those two things are both important. The subjectivity, right, which comes from Kant, the relativity is added by the later position, because people are arguing that Kant can't maintain the universality claim.
Right. So you cannot blame that on Kant proper.
That part, Kant, yes.
Okay.
Now, but I want to say, though, if we talk about classically minded painters, what the Kantian move means, first and foremost for classical art, is that the entire representationalist project is suspect at best, or to be abandoned. If you are doing any sort of representational art, you are now, in the Kantian universe, by definition, not a serious artist. You are only concerned with how things look and how things can be rationally reproduced in various ways. And that is all just the phenomenal world. That is the less important world. And any self-regarding artist who says, I am about serious stuff, has to be interested in what's reality real. So figurative art, more broadly representational art, are relegated to a lower order of art. And then as that tradition works out, they become non-art. They just become trivial. Right. And the pejorative is kitsch, right, by the time we get to a century later.
And that's what, just recommending this book, Kant, Art and Art History by Mark Cheetham. He talks about how Kant has influenced the modern idea of art, not only through his aesthetics, but through his general philosophy as well. And clearly saying that when Greenberg attacks kitsch, Greenberg's kitsch is Kant's barbarism. But Kant talks about being emotionally gripped and liking a picture because of that.
Yeah, and it's a barbaric pleasingness.
Yes, sensuality, being emotionally gripped, all those things that interfere with a pure objective judgment, right?
That's
so
right.
Yeah. So give us the bullet points then on the critique of judgment. Like, what are his main points that underbuild what you just said?
Well, yeah, broadly speaking, then Kant's two main concepts in art and aesthetics are beauty and the sublime. And they represent the highest achievement in their respective domains. So significant amount of critique of judgment is analyzing the concept of beauty and examples of beauty. So all of the standard examples are going to be naturalistic, physicalistic, sensually available items. So we can talk about a beautiful landscape or a beautiful woman or a beautiful seascape or whatever, a beautiful arrangements of flowers on a lovely old wooden table. And so beauty can be applied to all of those concepts, and the issues of sensory appeal and getting the proportions and perspectives correct and so forth in a way that's harmoniously integrated and pleasing to our cognitive faculties at that level, our senses and our reason. We like looking at these things. We like reflecting on these things. We like admiring the skill and the craftsmanship of the artist who made all of these things. So he has an analysis of beauty that is kind of sophisticated, but in one sense traditional. So the big move, though, in critique of judgment is when they say we take all of that and in effect we put it in a box. All of that is only about the phenomenal world. And it is its sensory appeal and its rational appeal. But what we have learned then from the earlier critique of pure reason, is all of that is subjective, right? And now lesser. And so what we are interested in, if we are serious artists, and he wants to say some serious artists have had this intimations of this, is, as we would be, as a serious philosopher, as a serious artist, well, what really is important, what really is real, and that you're not concerned with superficial things that are merely pretty, or things that are merely an appeal to your senses, or merely appealing to your reason now, because your reason has to be seen as subject to these severe limitations. So I want to get the truth. I want to get reality. I want to get to the most important things. I want to get to the sublime. And now there's a tradition, of course, of the concept of the sublime, which to some extent has been captured in art, but there's a broader sense of the sublime as the highest psychological experience one can have as a human being. Right? Something might be pretty or pleasing. Something might be beautiful, and that's a greater compliment. But then to say that is just sublime is the highest experience a human being, right, can have. So sometimes in intellectual history, so mathematicians, for example, who've been working on some extraordinarily difficult problem, but they succeed, they will say, this solution is sublime. Right? And it's not just, a merely pretty thing, but there's an elegance, and they know that they have unlocked some sort of secret of the universe, and they are experiencing that highest. Or those of us, when we are falling in love and fully captured by the other person we have fallen in love, and all of our being is elevated, and I feel like I'm being the best person I can be, and sharing that so deeply and intimately all of the important things with this other person, that love as sublime experience. And then in aesthetics, the experience of nature, or certain capturings, right, of nature, right, or some aspect of reality that is capable of elevating us to that kind of experience. Or when music at its best can grip us and take us over entirely and make us feel that every fiber of our being is alive and energized, and that I am really connected with something deep in the nature of the universe, that sublime experience in music. So there has been a tradition in art of trying to figure out what is going on in the sublime, and how can we understand it philosophically and artistically. So in Critique of Judgment, Kant makes a significant transition from his concerns with beauty to concerns with the sublime. And what he wants to argue is that this maps on to the early metaphysical and epistemological divide that had been developed in Critique of Pure Reason. So to put it shortly, and this is finally getting to a bullet point, beauty is only about the phenomenal, sublime concerns itself with the noumenal, or the beauty at most is only about this subjectively created reality. Sublime is giving us intimations or possible access to real reality. So we are left at the end of the first critique with the idea that yes, we have this physical world that's available to the senses and to our reason, and we can do our science and talk with each other and so forth. But the big metaphysical questions: is there really a God? Do we have free will? Is our soul immortal? We cannot know the answers to those, but nonetheless, those are burningly important questions to us. And Kant does he spends a great deal of time figuring out ways in which we can operate on the assumption that God exists, that we have an immortal soul, that free will exists, and so on. But at best, he wants to say those are just regulative ideas. I can't prove that they are true or that they are real, but they are going to govern our existence if we are good beings. But still, I want something more. I want to have access to real reality. I want to know and feel. And he wants to say that all humans have this, the sense of being in the presence of God, the sense of being part of the infinite. I can't know it, but somehow we can have intimations of it or access to it. And what he is suggesting then is that the experience of the sublime is one possible vehicle for doing so. And that's going to open up a huge amount of territory for post-Kantian art theory.
So he delegates that role, sort of the somehow sort of shamanic role, to the artist then.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And so one of the feeder threads for then Romanticism as a broad philosophical movement, I'm going to say one of the feeder threads, is explicitly coming out of Kantianism and the critique of judgment and his concept of the sublime. And their bullet point version is going to be to say that we cannot get to ultimate reality by our senses. It's not observable. We can't get there now by reason, by thinking and arguing our way to it. But maybe there is something special and unique about artistic and aesthetic experience.
Right. So we feel about it, we don't think about it.
Yeah, that's right. And so if we are the right kind of artistic, I don't want to use the word sensibility, or I'll put it in quotation marks again. We're just cheating all the time here with these quotation marks. That if I am the right kind of aesthetic person, and I channel my aesthetic something or other. So we find this in Schelling, we find this in some of the romantics. Then through aesthetic experience, I can either go into ultimate reality, or at least I can open up a space in my psyche for communications from it. The other big, just let me say one more bullet point named Schopenhauer wants to say it's explicitly not painting, not sculpture, because those are too tied to the sensual, too tied to the rational. They're not going to get you there. But music, what he wants to say is kind of, you can't look at music and you can't reason about music too much. Instead, music just seems to take over another part of our soul. It shuts down our rational minds. It shuts down our sensory minds. We just retreat into the music, and that music is a kind of vehicle for us to get out of the phenomenal world and into the ultimate reality.
Yeah, so there are, so there's strains from, or points in the epistemology and metaphysics that come together in the critique of judgment. So when he's at least in the tradition from him being anti-realist, that makes it so that we cannot trust any kind of craft, because we're trying to trust our senses, we're trying to trust some objective rules, and that doesn't work because you can never get to the physical reality, right?
Or to ultimate reality.
Yeah. So and also there's a anti-sensuality to it too, because he's saying, speaking of Schopenhauer, there's a funny passage in the Critique of Judgment where he sets up the different arts according to value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, isn't it so that he places poetry on the top? Because, and this is my understanding of it, because letters are just abstract signs. They are not. If you write apple, it's not an imitation of an apple. It's just abstract signs giving you the idea of an apple in your head.
Yeah.
So that would be sort of a perfect illustration of the Kantian idea. If you try to paint an apple, it's naive. But if you just write apple, then you create apple in your head, and that's
right. It's a purely abstract, rational
and
symbol.
that's a very cunning thing that Kant does. I mean, he gives how difficult or bad he writes. He is very skilled at giving compliments, because he's saying then that you are the one who creates beauty, right?
Yeah.
He says to the audience, and then he says to the genius, the artist, you are the one who decides what is right or wrong for you in terms of what you create. Right?
Yeah. So to make one other example, but jumping ahead, if you think of Magritte, right, and the pipe, where he's saying this is not a pipe, right? He's exactly playing with this issue of the object, the perception of the object, and the verbalization of the object.
And then that aesthetical indifference comes in, which is a key component in the Critique of Judgment.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is the okay. So there's he's saying that one of his major bullet points is that the genius or art is the opposite of craft, because craft is something you do just to make money. So here's the Protestant ethics too.
Yeah, he has an anti-commercialism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that the artists will accept that they shall suffer and not get paid. That's a positive view. Yes. So he undercuts all the possibilities you have to show your skills and to actually capture physical reality. So he continues the idea presented in the two first critiques in the idea of the genius, who then, you take away his ability to base himself on craft, you take away his ability to trust his senses, and you say, don't be sensual, don't be sentimental in any kind of way, don't be intense.
Don't be sensual, don't be emotional, or
Yes.
don't be rational.
Right.
Is the other big part to be added
Yeah, so
to
there's
that.
not much left.
That's right. So necessarily, the real artist, the artistic genius, is going to be irrational.
Yeah.
And that comes out in his understanding of the genius.
Right. And that's where I'm thinking, so if you jump ahead, or jump forward, and I believe this to be I don't mean it polemically, but I do think it really comes from the Kantian way of thinking. So this is a specific example. In Austria, there was this mass murderer called Jack Unterweger. He was imprisoned. He had killed and raped a lot of women, and then in prison he started writing poetry. And suddenly the intellectual elite, the artists, got interested in him, and they argued that he should be let free. And at a certain point he was, and of course he raped and killed more women before he was caught. And I'm thinking, that is a perfect illustration of the genius, who has no boundaries, who has no rules to follow, who just is, who just feels what he shall do, right? I mean, like in the extreme case, that is the consequence of the whole liberated genius who is not bound by any kind of, sort of physical restraints or physical rules or moral rules.
Yes. Now, the concept of feeling is tricky there. So again, we would have to say Kant would not celebrate the feeling route. He would celebrate the anti-rational route. But in his personal philosophy, he is still very much anti-feeling. So it's going to be a post-Kantian maneuver, which is then to say, well, if we are interested in the sublime, how are we going to get there? And Kant has said we're not getting there by our senses, we're not getting there by craft, we're not getting there by reason. It has to be some anti-rational or non-rational capacity. But what that capacity is, there are a number of candidates that post-Kantian thinkers will follow. Some might argue that it is through religious feeling, or through music, or through some sort of revelatory faith that comes from the other side. And so those are all explicitly anti-rational post-Kantian moves. But there will be post-Kantians who will say, look, Kant was just a prig, to use that English word. No, he was a prig, and it is more. He was very upstanding, uptight, anti-feeling. You just have to follow these strict moral rules without thinking about consequences and so on. But that was just a peculiarity of Kant, and we have to perhaps resuscitate the idea that through feeling, that we have another cognitive capacity, that feelings are not just subjective and not to be trusted, but maybe feelings are the vehicle through which we are ultimately going to access the noumenal world or have it revealed to us. So there's a rehabilitation after Kant of subjective feeling as one possible vehicle.
So you could call this Unterweger a post-Kantian genius.
Yes.
Because he was then again, quote unquote, sublime in that he was fully into his emotions, just expressing himself and having no restraints at all.
So again, jumping ahead a century, Expressionism is going to be the consequence of that strain of post-Kantianism. The idea there, we don't really observe the world like the Impressionists do. No, that's exactly right. We don't think too much about it. Instead, we try to shut down our minds, shut down our senses.
We just feel about it.
That's right. We just subjectively feeling of whatever comes out, that's my art. Okay, so yes, absolutely. That is going to be one possibility of development.
But then the so-called more intellectual idea would be then the whole argument, which is one of those art cliches, that cubism shows you the whole reality from different perspectives at once, so it's more true somehow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the slogan there.
Right.
Right.
But that you could say that you could attribute that directly to Kant. Would you say so?
I would not. I would say there's another development that goes on there, because one standard interpretation of cubism is to say that we have a cognitive limitation with respect to our senses, that we only see things from a particular point of view in a moment of time, and that what we are trying to do, this is the good news cover story version of cubism, is to be more scientific.
What is said about it,
That's right. And then say that the truth is that the object is multidimensional and persists across time, and so there are multiple perspectives. And so to be true to our art, we need to find a way to capture the persistence of the object. And the only way to do that is to break the object up and put the different perspectives on it.
And just by coincidence, that goes together with the complete destruction of the idea of craft or sensual representation.
Yes, that's right. But that's why I want to say that's partly a cover story. Now, there is an interesting issue about how you try to integrate a third dimension in painting, and that's an interesting project. How do you try to integrate changes across time in painting, because painting is timeless and two-dimensional. So the darker version then is to say what we want to do is just show the limitations of painting with cubism. Painting really is just superficial, and it's only capturing an element, and so we're going to try to break up the canvas and also break up your psychology as you're trying to understand the canvas. And we're not interested in any sort of harmonious integration. The cubists are always fractured and a little bit tortured, so there is other stuff that's going on.
So the right consequence from Kant is that you cannot capture reality because you cannot trust your senses, and you cannot understand reality because of our limited reason, right?
Yes.
So that's the destructive.
That's right.
Part.
Now, where you go from there, there's going to be 10 different options. Once you say we're not going to be sensory and we're not going to be rational, what follows from that? Well, lots of weirdness is possible.
And what this does is there's so many things that comes out of this. I mean, one other thing that Kant has as a major bullet point, of course, is the originality. So what he does then is also to, sever your ties. Again, I'm talking as a painter. Sever your ties. If you take Kant literally, or today many people just think like that or feel like that unconsciously. A consequence of that is that, oh, I cannot look at Rembrandt. Oh, I cannot look at Nerdrum. I mean, how many times from people who don't know even know how to spell the word philosophy have I heard, well, when are you going to liberate yourself from Nerdrum and become yourself? They don't know that Kant ever lived. And they are spitting images of that one idea. So for a painter to unconsciously, like by osmosis, having acquired those ideas, is extremely destructive for your development as a painter, because every time you see someone in the past who's your soulmate, so to speak, then you think, oh, no, I mustn't touch it.
No, there's a couple of ways of getting there. I mean, the explicit remarks Kant makes about originality and severing it from tradition. So there's an idea of continuity and an idea of progress, that people are figuring things out, and you can learn from those and then add your own individuality, but in a cumulative direction. So that is also a part of the Enlightenment project, which is to see art and science as brothers or sisters in arms, so to speak. So no scientist is going to say, I just ignore everything that has gone on in scientific tradition and I'm just going to figure out something brand new and original. Rather, it is meant to be a cumulative project of standing on the shoulders of the giants who went before you. But there's another line that's worth mentioning here right now. So that's about time. So if you are in any sense a traditionalist or learning from those who went before, you're putting yourself on a timeline and seeing yourself as a continuance of that timeline. But then philosophically, Kant, what does he say about time? Time is not an objective feature of the world. Time is a subjective, additional construct. So, again, if we want to get outside of the merely phenomenal world and outside of the merely sensual world, we have to get out of time. And so the only way you can be out of time is by breaking with all tradition. Right? And so you just, what is going to happen, and it has to be something completely shocking to the sensibilities of people who are still stuck in the physical, phenomenal world, and it has to be completely new, and that is going to be the marker that you are actually an artist.
Right. And that's where I still think you can tie Kant directly to this Unterweger. Because he does something, did something that is so apart from what you would even think of doing.
I don't know that particular example, so I would need to research it a little bit. But I think there's some later developments that it's explicitly a rapist and a criminal whom certain segments of the art community want to rehabilitate and use. So I think there's at least a cultural, perhaps a political agenda that needs to be added to that.
Well, you could say that, but it's So in the critique of judgment, there's the anti-sensuality, anti-rationality, that you shouldn't, because you shouldn't learn craft, because then you're hindering your own inner voice. And then there's the subjectivity of the genius, right? And what I'm thinking about, that is a fourth, or is connected with, these things are interconnected. Another thing that is a highly destructive idea that comes from it is that, okay, when you have this idea of the aesthetical indifference, that things are subjective, you're also distancing yourself, if you buy into that, from a more archetypal or eternal perspective. Because there's no such thing as something that is archetypal, or if it is, you shouldn't try to capture it in a sensual manner, right? So you are then also severing yourself from, that's the irony of it. I mean, at the same time as it says to deny knowledge to make room for faith, he is also, through the critique of judgment, denying that you should have contact with the sense of being a part of something bigger, as people typically say, of an eternal context, right?
Yes, that's right. So the concept of time there, eternal, is still a little bit tricky, because in some sense we have to...
Say archetypal then.
Yeah, in some sort of universality. Now, there is another road that we can explore here. One is to say, for the post-Kantians, Kant has said there's ultimate reality or noumenal reality out there, and in principle we cannot know it through reason or through our senses. So that then opens the door to those who want to say, well, I still want to get there, to come to know ultimate reality, and I will explore various non-rational ways of doing so. The other way, though, as another post-Kantian route, is then to say, but Kant has also said that what we call our subjective phenomenal reality is a result of unconscious subjective forces that are kind of objective and universal and built into the human condition. So what I need to do, my project, is not so much to get out there, but as to get deeper into my subjectivity. And so there becomes an inward turn to try to figure out what are these universal unconscious structures.
But you find them from yourself. That's the genius.
Well, you'll have to start with your phenomenal world and somehow get back there. And Kant tries to do a certain amount of analytic and reduction to get there as well. But again, to jump a century later to thinkers like Sigmund Freud, who was then interested in, say, well, obviously the conscious mind is just superficial and not really dealing with reality, and it's a kind of certain amount of ego construct. The real action is in the unconscious. And so the exploration is to try to figure out what's going on in the unconscious. So I'm totally uninterested in the perceptual world. I'm totally uninterested in any sort of ultimate reality with gods or a transcendent being, or the scientific project to figure out what the ultimate unifying forces of the universe are. I am totally interested in the unconscious, or the deep subconscious, or deep subjectivity. And so that entire inward turn is also another movement that comes out, not only in psychology, but it comes out in literature and the arts more broadly.
Yeah. And you see it visually in modern art.
Yeah.
And I think that's a yet another part of the tragedy. If you, as a classical painter, think like that you are limiting yourself to what is going on in your private person, then you lose out on what makes a work classical, which is to go out and see, okay, what is universally human? And so then you could say, okay, there are a lot of examples within modernism of sort of more spiritual painters who have an idea of reaching something universal, which could be understood as archetypal. But then, from the critique of judgment, you are banned from capturing that in a mimetic form, a recognizable form.
There's a passage, I just need to interrupt on this.
Yeah.
It says in section 29, I'm not sure, Critique of Judgment, we can look it up, where Kant says the most sublime passage in the Jewish scriptures, and so there's the word sublime in the Jewish scriptures, is thou shalt make no graven images.
He says that.
He says that explicitly.
Right.
So what he is then saying, and we know from Jewish tradition and now in Islamic tradition, exactly on scriptural authority, is the visual representational arts are forbidden.
Yeah.
And what Kant then is doing is reaching that same conclusion, but without basing it on scripture, reaching it through philosophical sophistication. So it's very interesting then that modernist painters and modernist sculptors and people in the modernist movement, who will obviously think of themselves as not just old scripture thumpers and true believers, are reaching the exact same place.
Yeah,
and so that sort of scriptural fundamentalism and modernism, which seem like cultural opposites, both of them are sharing fundamentally an attack on any sort of representationalism, figuratism, and naturalism in the arts.
The filthy, lowly body. Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
So I know there's absolutely arguments to be made that forbidding images is a misunderstanding of that idea. But what you're saying is that Kant is taking that literally to mean that you shall not create a graven image.
Well, the traditional idea is there's a metaphysical dualism, right? So, the gods or God is purely spiritual,
so
not
they can never
physical.
be captured physically.
Yeah, so it can't be captured physically, just as a metaphysical point. But also, it's a sacrilege to try to do so because the higher world is better and this world is lower and vulgar. So you're trying to bring something that is higher down to something lower, and that is a bad thing to do. So, whether that's a misinterpretation or not, of course, that's an interesting issue.
But he takes it to mean that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the tradition, the fact that there is not a tradition of visual arts in Judaism and Islam means that is the mainstream interpretation of it. So Kant is saying that they are capturing something correct, but he wants to give a non-religious justification for that capturing.
And I'm thinking also, so even though you you don't get caught by that part of it, but you're a classical painter and you have this idea or these unconscious Kantian ideas in your head. And I know there are many classical painters who are focused very much on beauty. I mean, you have Roger Scruton writing about beauty, of course. And I think that is also a dead end. Because what happens is that if you contradict that with the Greek idea, they didn't have in the 18th century understanding a term of aesthetics, meaning just disinterested contemplation. It was a matter of getting it as so alive as possible. This idea is about the Aphrodite figure being sort of defiled by this young man, this sort of wet stain on her thigh the next morning, because it was so vivid, right? Which is completely opposite of the aesthetical indifference, where you judge the object that was compiled, and it's something that doesn't relate to your sensuality in any way. So if a classical painter then has this idea of beauty, there immediately comes in some sort of a distance to it. It's just making, then you get that idea of making just pretty paintings very easily. And the whole idea of creating an emotional drama, a Baroque drama, gets totally sidestepped, because that is fake, that is manipulative, that is tricking the audience, that is kitsch, as it was called. So you have the origin of working classically in the first place to create these great dramas, which is at least 50% of the value of classical work, that is then just completely taken out. The eternal aspect is completely taken out, and it just becomes, ironically, a figurative illustration of Kant's ideas. Because I think that's an interesting thing. We're not talking really about abstract versus figurative, because there's a lot of accepted figurative art, but it has the expression, totally aesthetical indifferent expression, which can satisfy his aesthetic philosophy.
That's a rich comment. So if you think of the classical traditions up to 18th century, they're working toward art that is extraordinarily robust. So it has a sensory appeal or a physical appeal. But it also appeals to our minds. We like to look at it and analyze in various ways, or we like to think about the abstract themes and what they mean for broader human concepts of dignity and morality and what it means to be a human being. And they're also emotionally engaging. So the idea here is that the human being as this complex, we have this thing that we're increasingly calling art, that is able to interest and excite us sensually, excite us rationally and emotionally, and in an integrated way, all at the right moment. So it's like you are fully being engaged with and pressed by this thing that we call the artistic experience. So one way then of reading Kant then is to say that he is explicitly recognizing that art is on this trajectory of, it's about the sensory, it's about the rational, it's about the emotional at their highest level, and all of them integrated. And his project is to disintegrate all of them.
He twists it in the completely opposite direction again.
Yeah, but it starts, and this is to use a 20th century term, he starts with a deconstruction. So first, it's reason versus emotions, not reason integrated with emotions. Yeah. It's reason versus the senses, right, rather than reason working with the senses. And it's the senses versus emotions rather than them working with each other. So we break them all into, so it's a divide and conquer strategy. And then we say, well, that's merely sensual, that's merely rational, and then for other reasons. Yeah,
merely
emotions.
is a Kantian word.
Yeah, exactly, and it's really rational. So it's first a disintegration and then a destruction of each of those elements.
So that you get, if you accept the premises, you get two options. Either, sort of very simply put, either abstract art or figurative. But without, so that the abstract art then becomes like pure spirituality, and the figurative painters think we're going to make really good images, it's going to be really, exactly how it is, and they forget the whole eternal context, the metaphysical content of it.
That's right. So you can say, all right, well, if it's all fractured, then I'm only interested in the perceptual elements of it. That's right. And there's no deeper meaning, and it's not meant to be emotionally engaging. There are other figures then who will say, well, I'm not interested in the sensual or the rational, I'm just purely all about emotionalist expression and so on. And there are, of course, others who then will say, I'm not interested so much in the sensual or the emotional, I am interested in the hyper-rational. So I'm looking for perhaps the underlying structures that can be mathematically expressed. So here, I'm trying to think of some examples. So, if we want to then say, it's just about lines, but I'm just interested in very cool, minimal sensory appeal presentations of lines in various geometric forms, and that's all my art is about. Now that's a kind of reduction. That is going to come out. Or I'm only interested in basic colors, and I'm kind of making a rational point about it. Or maybe I'm even being rationalist about the senses, that rather than seeing my sensory experience of the world in kind of Van Gogh fashion, where it's very vitalistic and movement and dramatic and appealing to my emotion. Instead, I just take a scene and I just reduce it to a number of dots, right, in Seurat fashion, where it's just this color and it's kind of scientifically placed next to this color, next to that color, and so on, and it's emotionally very cool.
So that's interesting. So you get tricked into separating things that were integrated before, because that you see that in. That comes, it's a gradual transition, but it comes in the 19th century where you start getting, of course you had it to some degree before too, but it becomes an explicit point of being a portrait painter or a landscape painter or a still life painter. All of these things that a skilled master would integrate into one whole image before. You can't be a
universal painter anymore.
Right. So you are tricked into believing that just being a portrait painter, just being this or that, is the way to go. Right.
So
and again, you lose out of this the human drama, the sensual, which with a richer image that encompasses all aspects of human life.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so done with Kant.
Okay.
How do we build up something positive from here? Like if you talk, because we're talking about the general basic ideas, is it Aristotelian epistemology and metaphysics, or like what would you set up as an alternative?
Well, broadly speaking, I am Aristotelian in my approach. You mentioned Rand. There's a huge amount that we can learn from Rand as well. So there are people, neo-Aristotelians, subjectivists, and others, and not limited to those, who are still working on the broader project. So I'm going to speak though as a philosopher, because the argument I'm going to make is that Kant is the most important philosopher of the last 2 centuries. And if the conversation that we have had is that, and there's still work to be done, that what is going on in art critical theory in the decisive decades of the 20th century with figures like Greenberg and others is Kantianism, kind of updated with respect to evolutions. And if we can take the major sub-schools of modernist and then later postmodernist philosophy and do the intellectual history well, to see them as downstream from what is ultimately a significant Kantian term.
Culture is downstream from Kant.
That's exactly right. And there are, now this is extraordinarily controversial in the Kant literature, but I and then some of the leading Kant scholars who are reflecting will say we are, this is slightly overstated, we're all Kantians now, right? Or we are all working in the shadow of Kant. And so when first-rate philosophers are making claims like that, we need to pay attention to that. So what I think has to happen is we do need to go back to Kant. He has distinctive theses in epistemology, or implications for metaphysics. He ends up being anti-metaphysical for the reasons that we have talked about, kind of dismissing it entirely as a possible concern for philosophy. Particular theses in moral philosophy, and as we've talked with respect to art. So if we really are about truth, goodness, and beauty, and Kant is fundamentally negative on all of those, but he's the most important philosopher, then what that means is that the first-rate people need to go back, understand their Kant, and figure out what the alternatives to him are, so that we can in fact come to know the world, that we can in fact see the human being as an integrate, that we can in fact figure out positive answers to value questions, to questions of beauty and the sublime, and work out that intellectual framework. Because the way it is right now is it's partly institutional. If we just look at the high art world, the high art world has done basically nothing for a century. It's all just variations on a theme.
On aesthetical indifference, basically.
That's right. So Duchamp, 1917. So we're now a century past Duchamp. There has been nothing significant or fundamentally new in the art world for over a century. That should be a huge embarrassment for artists, right? To think that we are just recycling old tropes that are now a century old. So there is a stagnance there. But artists, they can be very sensitive and very clever. I think you used the word osmosis, right? They're drawing it out of the intellectual atmosphere. But they're not necessarily art critics, educated in art history at that level of, PhD sufficiency. And they're not necessarily philosophers, and they're not necessarily on the front lines of what's going on in psychology. So they're very good as artists, but artists function in a broader intellectual and cultural framework. So they do need to, if we want to rescue the artists, or the artists want to rescue themselves, they need to realize that they have been put in a box.
Right.
And they're only allowed to play in that box and to figure out what that box is and find a way to break out of it.
Right. So you start with the immediate constraints, so to speak, or immediate awareness.
Yeah.
And understand what Kant is all about, so that you can take a better choice according to what kind of direction you want your work to go in.
Now, I think there's a division of labor there. The psychologists and the philosophers and the art historians and the artists all have, part of the package, and so they do need to work together. I would say, though, probably the most important thing is going to be, though, for young artists. By the ones I mean when you're in your teens and you've not yet gone off to formal art school, to find whatever way of strengthening your resolve, what attracted you to art in the first place. Because the post-Kantians are now very sophisticated and they are institutionalized. When they get their hands on you, when you go into art school, they are very good at deconstructing you and turning you into another zombie. Yeah. So that's where the fight has to be. Yeah.
So just be aware of the main components of Kantian and Kantian-influenced philosophy can help you to understand what's coming. And I think that's, so we're not going to discuss the kitsch term as such, but that's my argument, or one of the arguments I have for the kitsch term for classical painting, is that it gives you a clear understanding of these two value systems, with aesthetical indifference or sentimentality, with the genius not needing craft or basing yourself on craft, being original or being more archetypal. And then you can say, check, 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 and say, where am I?
I think that's a very good starting point.
In any case, that it's a way of orienting yourself and finding out what is my direction. And when these Kantians or post-Kantians come, then you can recognize, okay, it comes from that point, but that belongs to that value system, and I'm here.
Yeah, the more intellectually armed you can be, certainly the better.
Yeah.
The hard thing, though, is that if you want to be an artist, you need to pour yourself into doing your art, and you can't also get a PhD in philosophy or psychology at the same time. But you do need to have a certain amount of intellectual armor in your defense, so you can't let it slide. Yeah,
because don't let Kant fool you, because one of the things he does say is that the genius doesn't know what he's doing, so he needs a philosopher to decide,
to rationalize.
So people have then accepted that. Oh, I'm not supposed to think. That's what the philosopher shall do for me.
That's right.
And then so you're stuck in the box.
Right. No, exactly right. That's just to come almost full circle. Yeah. That's what Greenberg did for Pollock. Pollock would have been in obscurity, because nobody's going to go in and see what Pollock is doing in his studio and say, oh, this is great art. It takes a Kantian intellectual like Greenberg, who has a social status, to say, this is it. And then suddenly, oh, yes, he's a genius, and then the money and the prestige follows. Okay. And then everybody starts to imitate Pollock because they want to be in the club.
But then the slight danger is, as Cheetham mentions in his book, there's this painter, I think his name was Ferno, and he started reading Kant and lecturing on Kant for some painters in Rome. And the end of this story was that he stopped painting because he was reading Kant. You see,
perfect anecdote.
Yes. Yeah, right. So I mean, that's where I'm thinking. Okay, to read Kant, understand him, but always have something else that builds you up. Yeah. So if you want to give us some sort of famous last words on that, I like one of those bullet points again on that. What is if you're an Aristotelian. Yeah. What about Aristotle's philosophy as such? Because we've been talking about epistemology and metaphysics and aesthetics. In Aristotle's case, poetics.
Yeah, no, I would say I'm broadly Aristotelian. I think Aristotle is the greatest philosophical genius of all time. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become an Aristotle scholar. I would say, read some Aristotle. It will be enriching to you. I also want to say that Aristotle was 2,400 years ago. Lots of things need to be updated. So there's still a significant amount of work for philosophers and psychologists and art historians to do. But the main point here is that Aristotle is a naturalistic philosopher. The natural world is the real world. We might be able to argue our way to something beyond the natural world as well, right? But that's where we start, and it's real, it's knowable, and the human being is capable of really magnificent things. If he or she develops his core capacities for sensibility, for reason, for passion in an integrated way, you will put together a full life. You will become something special yourself, and you will, if you're going to be an artist, be a contributor to the already then impressive traditions of great art.
So if you read Kant, then you can deconstruct your subconscious presumptions, and then you can read Aristotle to build yourself.
Yeah, he's the foundation for sure.
Okay. Stephen Hicks, this has been very, shall we say, enlightening.
Nice word.
Thank you for coming to the KO Palace.
Okay, pleasure, thanks.
And thank you for watching. Remember to head over to kopalace.com/subscribe and become a member today. I'll see you next month.